That's right in front of the Quebec Parliament building. From there, they will walk along Rue Saint-Louis, one of the oldest streets in Quebec City, and then they will cut across the city and walk back down Rue Saint-Jean past Youville Square, which is known as the gateway to Old Quebec. They end where they started at the Fontaine de Tourny for more events. Well, we want to hear from you about those G7 demonstrations. Do protests accomplish anything at these big international summits? We want to have you join the conversation. Head over to CBC News' Facebook page. You can find that at facebook.com/CBC News. You can leave your questions in the comments section. We'll ask it of the CBC's Jonathan Montpetit, who joins us right now in front of the Quebec Legislature, the National Assembly building in Quebec City. So, Jonathan, hello to you. I want to begin with the protesters that you are seeing this time around at this G7 summit. Who are they? Who do they represent?
Well, I think so. Basically, this is the third day of protest, and on each day there's kind of been different groups who've come out and kind of taken the lead. On Thursday, you had a kind of an anti-capitalist, anti-colonialist march. A lot of the concerns there were about extractivism. A lot of people upset with the Trans Mountain Pipeline nationalization by Justin Trudeau. Yesterday, you saw mainly Bloc anarchists, again, a more radical anti-capitalist, radical activists come out in the streets of Quebec City. They tried to disrupt intersections. They tried to block a highway leading to the summit. They weren't very successful. And then today, you'll see behind me, you can see the round table going on. A lot of unions are coming out, community groups, some NGOs were out this morning. So today is really a day of protest from the more moderate groups, and they'll be, as you explained earlier, taking a protest march through the streets of Quebec City.
Now, I want to ask about that because you did mention the fact that right now there's a roundtable of the more quote-unquote moderate groups that are part of these protests, but you also mentioned the Black Bloc. What is the relationship between these two groups? How easy of a relationship exists between these two groups?
Well, I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is, the Black Bloc is not considered a group. It's considered a tactic that is adopted by anti-capitalist activists. The relationship is an uneasy one. I spoke to a lot of people here who feel it's very much fractured. The anti-capitalists, they kind of take a more revolutionary position. They don't believe the G7 or other global institutions can be reformed, so they don't feel like the kind of more traditional forms of protest, which don't engage in direct action, which don't engage in civil disobedience, can be very effective. So that's why they went out and tried to block intersections. They really were trying to disrupt the G7 itself. Again, like I said, they were not very successful in that. And the more moderate groups here today, they're kind of more interested in education, lobbying efforts, signing petitions, the kind of conventional political activity that I think most Canadians are familiar with.
Now, as I said, this is a conversation that you and I are having right now, Jonathan, but we're also inviting people on Facebook to ask their questions. And we have one question right now. This one being asked on Facebook by someone who identifies themselves as Surly, asking, has any G7 protest ever resulted in a tangible policy outcome advocated by the protesters?
That's a very interesting question, and it's one question I've asked a lot of people here. And I think they take a longer-term view. So whether or not these protests today resulted in kind of concrete action from the leaders in their final communique, which we're expecting, I guess, the next couple of hours, if it hasn't already been released, probably not. However, a lot of people point out that issues that were being raised by the anti-globalization movement 20 years ago, issues like Indigenous rights, issues like environmental concerns, gender equality, these are issues that weren't on the agenda 20 years ago at these meetings, and now we're seeing they're really taken as a priority by world leaders of the G7. So that's the kind of tangible concrete action that a lot of the protesters feel they've achieved. So it's not from one protest that they kind of affect change, but through repeated protests over a very long period of time. We're talking about 20 years or so taken to kind of get these issues to the forefront. And of course, many of the people here will feel like the statements on women's education and women's leadership in business certainly don't go far enough and to meet their concerns, but they see it as a tangible result of their own activism.
Okay, Jonathan, stand by. We're going to take a short break here on CBC News Network, but the conversation does continue with Jonathan. That's on Facebook. You can get involved by going to facebook.com/CBC News. You can leave your questions in the comments, and Jonathan and I will return right after the commercial break. But again, our conversation will continue on Facebook. Well, now we are only live on Facebook for the commercial break. We have about 2 minutes here, Jonathan. And that said, I want to ask a question here. This is from Maureen Hodges, and she asked the following. Why are they protesting? I thought it was a good thing that nations get together and talk about solving problems. Does that not carry any weight with the protesters, Jonathan?
I think it carries some weight. I think the concerns that have been expressed to me are certainly is the sense that these meetings are not representative. There's very little civil society input. That's a complaint that I've heard a lot. Another issue that's been raised to me several times is the cost. $604 million to host the summit here in Quebec City. A lot of people are asking the leaders, couldn't that money have been better spent on social services or education programs or whatnot? So that's some of the concerns. Now, of course, there are more issue-specific ones related to the environment, related to Indigenous rights, like I mentioned before. So depending on who you speak to, you kind of will get different answers of whether or not the summit itself is a good thing. A lot of people feel it's not. And from the more radical element, you'll feel that it's not just that the meetings are unrepresentative, it's that the whole capitalist system, the whole system of global governance is set up in such a way as to disempower large populations around the world.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, I want to ask it one more time because you did mention it there, but the exact cost, because Bill on Facebook wants more details on the cost.
This is a big concern, a lot of people, so it's certainly more than $600 million assumed by the federal government alone. Of that, about $395 million has been earmarked for security measures. So of the $600 million, the vast majority of that is going towards security costs, and that does not include the security costs being assumed by the Quebec City Police Force as well as the provincial police here in Quebec, known as the Sûreté du Québec. So that kind of gives you a rough estimate of how much, not just the summit, but specifically the security operation associated with the summit has cost. Okay,
Jonathan, again, stand by. We're in commercial break right now on News Network. We're live on Facebook, but we're about to rejoin the audience in CBC News Network, so stand by. Here we go. And welcome back. We're taking your questions live on Facebook. G7 protesters are planning a big demonstration today in Quebec City. Do these protests accomplish anything at these big international summits? Well, we want to get you to join the conversation. You can head over to CBC News' Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/CBC News. You can leave your questions in the comments. Jonathan Montpetit, who is right now standing in front of the Quebec Legislature, the National Assembly building in Quebec City, is helping answer your questions. So a lot of questions about these protests, Jonathan. Right now, this is from Mary Catherine, who on Facebook asked the following question. Given Trump's recent labeling of allies as, quote, national security threats, what are protesters from outside Canada saying about that?
That's a very interesting question. It's one of the things I think that surprised a lot of us covering these demonstrations is how little Trump has actually come up amongst the people who are here. There's very little international involvement in these protests. Most of the people behind me, most of the people who were on the streets yesterday and Thursday were people from Montreal, were from Quebec City. Their concerns were largely, again, like about the Kinder Morgan project, the Quebec government here and cuts that it's made to social services during its time in power. So the international dimension hasn't been really to the forefront of these protests, which is kind of in a stark contrast to what we've seen in past kind of protest movements. Certainly the anti-globalization movement was one that was characterized by a strong international or globalist dimension, and we're not really seeing that here. I did happen to speak to a communist activist from Italy. He was, again, trying to portray things from his own concerns about Italy, which has seen a far-right populist government emerge. So people are kind of coming here with their own local and national concerns and not kind of the international dimension that we've seen in the past.
What does that say, though, about the popularity of these types of protests? Because I think about the Summit of the Americas, which was also hosted in Quebec City. In fact, that was days of rioting, and now it seems more peaceful, some disruptions, but more peaceful than what we saw at the Summit of the Americas. Does that say something about the popularity of these types of protests?
I think what it says is something more, in fact, about the kind of preferred tactics of various activists. Now, the kind of rise of the anti-globalization movement was accompanied with these massive demonstrations outside various types of summit meetings. So we saw 1999 in Seattle, of course, like you mentioned, 2001 in Quebec City. Since then, though, there's kind of been an emphasis on more local struggles, more space-based struggles, and I think what you're seeing is a kind of flourishing of a different type of protest activity. So you take the Idle No More, or the Black Lives Matter movement. So these are, of course, very vibrant expressions of activist sentiment, but there tend to be very community-based movements. And so because they're more community-based, when you have summits like this here in La Malbaie and the protests in Quebec City, you're not seeing the same kind of large crowds, because a lot of these smaller groups just don't have the resources they need to mobilize several hundred people, to travel several hundred kilometers to come to these summits to protest. So a lot of activists kind of caution me, don't read it as a slackening of protest activity, read it as a shift in our energies, a shift in focus in our targets.
I want to bring in a question here, and to be fair, Jonathan, I don't know if you can answer this given the fact that you said that there's not a lot of international protesters, but this is Joshua Allen Moore. Now, he's on Facebook, he's from the United States, and he says the following, quote, "I think our president is absolutely terrible. Can Jonathan talk about what Americans there are saying? If not Americans, and if there are Americans you can reference, by all means do so, but what are protesters saying about Donald Trump's presence, quick in and out, if you will, at the G7 summit in Charlevoix?"
So, like I was mentioning earlier, it's actually, Trump has come up hasn't really come up very much amongst the protesters here, because a lot of their concerns are more locally based, more community based. Trump is not a kind of overriding rallying point for a lot of the people here. I have not, in fact, come across any American activists on the ground here. I've come across a few people from Europe, a few people from Ontario, but the vast majority of people are from Quebec, and their concerns, again, are more about the Quebec government, the Canadian government, and more specifically still, the kind of massive security operation that has accompanied the protests. So, while certainly you won't find many Trump fans here today, he hasn't kind of been the topic of conversation that he was certainly in the G7 meetings happening in La Malbaie.
Okay. And Jonathan, we're about to wrap up our time here, at least you and I together. So before you go, though, I do want to, even though we began on top talking about the protests that will take place throughout today, walk us through what we might watch out for in the coming hours.
So basically, right now, what you're seeing behind me is a roundtable discussion from a number of activists, including a tax fairness group, also unions. A lot of these groups will take part in a march at 3 o'clock. It's going to start from here, the National Assembly, kind of make its way through the streets of Quebec City. The people who will be participating in the march, like I was mentioning earlier, mainly more moderate groups. A lot of unions from Montreal are making the trip, left this morning, should be arriving any moment now. You're going to see, local anti-gentrification groups here in Quebec City will take part in the march. Some NGOs will take part in the march. Just to the left of me is a communist organization which will be taking part in the march. So that's the kind of thing you're going to see today, kind of peaceful. At least we're expecting it to be peaceful. That will wrap up around 5, and then you're going to see concerts and a comedy show later tonight. Generally a more festive atmosphere than the more confrontational attitude which transpired on the streets yesterday.
Okay, Jonathan, thank you for this. That's Jonathan Montpetit in Quebec City. Now, Jonathan, this wraps up our time together with this conversation, but we have to point out that Jonathan will continue to answer your questions on Facebook. If you want to be part of the conversation with Jonathan in Quebec City, you can do so on our Facebook page. You can find that at facebook.com/CBC. Jonathan, thank you for that.
My pleasure, Michael. So hi guys, I'm now live on Facebook. Please send us your questions. My name is Jonathan Montpetit. I've been covering the demonstrations here in Quebec City for CBC Montreal for the past few days. Before that, I wrote a couple of pieces about the state of social movements in Quebec. We hope to get to as many questions as we can of you. Fire them in the comment section. If we can't get to them right away, we will certainly try to get to them in a bit. Just give me a second here and I'll load up the iPhone and see what we got. So I think it sounds like a lot of people are asking, what are they protesting for? So when you have an event like this, you have many different groups. I've counted about a dozen different groups are taking part in the demonstrations, and they're all representing kind of different constituents. So we can start with one particular constituency is kind of a more radical, anti-capitalist desire to see the end of the current system of government. They want to see a more socialist redistribution of power. So that's kind of one more revolutionary approach. I spoke to another group who took part in the protests a few days ago, a group called Ni Quebec, Ni Canada. They're an Indigenous rights group. They're very much concerned with extractivism, very concerned with the nationalization of the Trans Mountain pipeline in British Columbia. A lot of these people were also opposed to the Energy East project. Many of the people were Innu from Quebec, and they were dismayed to see that a lot of their leaders, or some of their leaders anyway, took part in the G7 summit at the invitation of Justin Trudeau. They felt that was amounted to something of a betrayal of their cause. Today, behind me, you're seeing mainly unions. So their primary concern is cuts to social services, cuts to welfare programs in Quebec. A big concern amongst many Quebec unions has been the workload faced by healthcare workers in the province. Nurses in the province have been forced to take on huge amounts of overtime hours in order to compensate for the lack of personnel. That's a concern you're going to hear a lot today. Another group I spoke to recently is called Attack Quebec. They're a kind of financial rights organization. They're basically arguing for fair trade. They kind of position themselves between the advocates of free trade, who are backing NAFTA, and the more protectionist policies of Donald Trump. So that kind of gives you a kind of quick overview of some of the groups. We have a story online that's kind of a who's who of the people protesting over the last 2 days and today. I encourage you to consult that. That will kind of also give you an overview of some of the groups here and what they're protesting for. All right, let's take another question. Johnny Vandel asks, hasn't it been peaceful so far? Yes, largely for the most part. Demonstration on Thursday evening, which walked through the streets of Quebec City, was largely peaceful. A few black-clad protesters did try to harass journalists, but there was no discernible property damage that I could tell. Yesterday's demonstrations were more direct in nature. They were more confrontational. Anarchist groups, anti-capitalist groups tried to take over a number of intersections in the city, tried to block traffic, tried to block a highway leading to La Malbaie. They weren't very successful. They weren't successful for very long periods of time. They did at one point burn a couple of couches. That, to me, seems the extent of the property damage that we saw yesterday, and certainly today there hasn't been any property damage that has been reported so far. I should mention, though, Johnny, that at the same time, there's been a very large police presence here that has accompanied the protests. A lot of rights groups, including Amnesty International and Ligue des Droits, a rights group here in Quebec, has been very concerned about the police presence. They feel it's overkill. They feel it's kind of squelched a lot of the legitimate dissent that they would have liked to see on the streets. Let's take another question here. Probably going to be our last question. Fred Harris asks, how many Anglophones are in the protest area? Well, we're still in Quebec City, so this is a largely Francophone population here. Most of the people here are Francophone. I did speak with a few individuals who are from Ontario, one who was from Italy. So because it's taking place in Quebec, a lot of the unions here are Quebec-based. Many of the people here are French. So that's, I don't know, maybe that gives you a little sense of the demographic makeup. Maybe one more quick question. Let's see. Crystal Clements asks, do you think there's been a dramatic shift towards a social media-based protest? A very interesting question. I think the role of social media, I think if you talk to a lot of activists, is very important. It helps organizing. It helps get the message out, but it doesn't replace the importance of having bodies in the streets, if you will. The importance of being seen in public spaces, occupying public spaces. It's a kind of an old school way, if you will, of protesting, but I don't think a lot of activists here have given up on the importance of that, despite us living in a digital age. Guys, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for your questions at the moment. However, keep firing them in the comment section. We'll get to as many as we can. I have colleagues at the office in Toronto and Montreal who will try to get you as much information as we can. Thanks so much for joining us, and hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.